Hello, good people, and welcome back to Unit 10 on the global economy. We are in our next to last lesson, not only in Unit 10, but for the entire course, rejoice. All right, so let's get into it. I will most likely call for the next two videos. Let it happen. All right, so first and foremost, what is an economic organization? And just know that from here on out, I'm going to be calling economic organizations EOs in order to save myself some time. So essentially, it's a group of nations who gather to either reach or continue on an agreement. This could be a political agreement that lends itself to an economic agreement, but typically speaking, countries are going to gather together in order to reach an agreement about resources, about money, about who they will and will not trade with, that sort of thing. They can share a region, so it can be a regional agreement, like for example, the European Union. So I would say probably 70% of Europe is all in this little squad together. Well, not really 70%. I'd say maybe 60% probably. All of them have kind of gotten together and they're like, listen, we'll trade back and forth with one another. People can kind of go freely in and out of different countries without having to stop through customs. So if you have a European Union country-based passport, let's say, for example, Norway or Finland or German or French, if you have a passport from those countries, you can drive from country to country pretty easily without having to really worry about whether or not you're allowed to go. Like, for example, if you want to cross the border from the United States into Canada or into Mexico, there is a long and lengthy process in order for you to actually go inside those countries' borders. You can drive pretty freely around like France, Germany, Italy, Poland, really, Switzerland, Belgium. You can drive pretty freely around Europe and not have to be stopped in between because all those countries have an agreement with one another to be nice to one another. You could have one about resources. For example, OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, basically the people who have got oil and send it to other humans. They have all got a little squad, and you can't really touch them. They got their own little gang. Or it could be based on a type of government or type of economy. So typically speaking, economic organizations pair like countries together. All right, and then the goal is ultimately to advance their interests if possible, but they can compromise if needed because they're just trying to make some cash the best way they can. All right, so ultimately, what do they do? It honestly depends on which one we're talking about. Some of them are created to accomplish specific goals like climate change, and they do so through economic threats, essentially, like the G20 or the G7, which is the name of group of 20 or group of 7. They're not very creatively named most of the time. There's going to be a lot of like acronyms and kind of like alphabet soup going around. In this particular lesson. Some of them are made to advance interest for a resource, like we said just a little bit ago. OPEC's goal is to advance the interests of nations who ship oil or petroleum or crude oil or any sort of petroleum good to another country. And because that is such a hot commodity, everybody uses gas to get around in their vehicles. Military branches need to use them in order to transfer people left and right and center. People use that to fly planes back and forth. So, OPEC is made to advance interest for a resource. Sometimes this is a pretty specific one. There are very few other economic organizations that are centered around one specific resource. But because oil and petroleum are so necessary and are so inelastic, if you remember talking about inelastic, like the demand basically never changes regardless of the price. They've gotten together and kind of like swindled people out of being able to essentially tell them what price things can be. So Saudi Arabia has a pretty large share of this. So essentially it tells you how much oil is in that particular country. Venezuela has, I think, the largest oil reserve in the world. Saudi Arabia's got quite a bit. Who else has got a large amount? The UAE, or the United Arab Emirates, have a large amount. Iraq has got 158 billion barrels of oil. This is in 2016. I'm sure it has increased so far. Equatorial Guinea, they don't really have data available. They're pretty new to OPEC. They joined in 2017. There is that. All right, so let's talk about economic organizations versus free trade agreements. We touched a little bit on free trade agreements in our last video, but we're going to touch on that a little more heavily today, more so in our next video on the global economy. So economic organizations are typically a lot more organized. They can last a lot longer than free trade agreements. I want to say free trade agreements have been around for a long time, and they're pretty prominent in our economy as far as how we trade and who we trade with, to the point where we have an entire executive office within the office of the president that is literally devoted to just free trade agreements. It is called the Office of the Free Trade Representative. It is not named super creatively, but that's fine. All right, so economic organizations are typically done so to advance a particular set of interests, and they do so for multiple countries. It's not just one or two or maybe three that are involved. Free trade agreements typically use a smaller amount of countries because it's just you and that. It's just you and that country. You're just having like a one-on-one convo about what you will or will not trade. And they can be broken a little bit more easily, especially if it's a newer trade agreement. If it hasn't been in place for very long, it doesn't hurt a country nearly as badly to break off a free trade agreement and start imposing tariffs and quotas and that sort of thing. So, for example, CAFTA is a Central American free trade agreement. It's technically called CAFTA-DR because it's Central America plus the Dominican Republic. So let's see who we got. Let's see if I know my flags. We got the DR over here. We got Costa Rica. This is Guatemala. This is El Salvador. Oh man, I can't remember which one is Nicaragua. I want to say Nicaragua has this triangle and Guatemala has the stars. Check me on that, and if I'm wrong, let me know. Send me an email. All right, so some major economic organizations in the world that are not free trade agreements and are an actual economic organization. The WTO, or the World Trade Organization, is one of the biggest, if not the largest trade organization in the world. This is a branch of the United Nations. So essentially just our big old group of countries that get together and make decisions and try to work out problems. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is another major one. The World Bank, the European Union. I will say the World Bank and the WTO work pretty closely together to handle any international economic crises. So, for example, COVID right now has got everybody scrambling in all kinds of ways, not just with regards to public health, but also with regards to trade. Because the way that we trade goods and services right now is being severely impacted by COVID. We essentially, as a globe, have gone pretty heavily online in a matter of months, and businesses are trying to scramble to keep up with that. And in order to honor free trade agreements, countries are having to kind of reevaluate their life. So the World Trade Organization has been bogged down pretty heavily with just kind of helping countries enforce free trade agreements on one another. All right, and the International Labor Organization is also a serious economic organization. So we talked about in Unit 9 labor unions being a pretty significant force to be reckoned with and being able to impact the economy pretty heavily. The International Labor Organization does essentially the same thing. So this is about labor unions. This is also about worker rights, employer rights, how long your workday can be, how much you are allowed to pay people, how much you are not allowed to fool with people's jobs and interests and health and that sort of thing. OPEC, we just talked about a little bit. The G7, the G20, and the Paris 21 are more so international organizations. They're more so like squads of countries who have agreed to do particular things with regards to the environment, but they do touch pretty heavily on economic development and what is allowed and what is not, especially with regards to natural resources. So I've decided to include them here. So the G7 is literally the group of seven. It's not necessarily seven countries though. So one group is the European Union, so all of these darker blue squads over here. Please notice how the UK is no longer a part of the European Union. They have decided to break off from the EU in a thing called Brexit. That was a big, giant controversy in British politics, and we can get into that in later times. So we got Canada, we got France, we got us over here. Who's this over in the bottom? I don't know who that is. That is Suriname, Paramaribo. I can't remember. It might be Guyana. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Sorry. If you're from there, let me know. Okay, so over here is called the G20, or your group of 20. You've got your Canadian homies over here. We got US, Russia, India, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Who's that? Germany, France, and the UK as well. Look at me knowing all my countries. All right, so with the European Union, these are people, like I said, the Schengen region, all these purple people and the blue people are cool with you just like bopping around, driving through these little nations without having to like stop and get out and go through customs. You can drive or even go through a train pretty easily, and you can get your passport stamped in all these different countries without having to have a big issue. This is done for political and for economic purposes as well. This benefits pretty much everyone. All right, so some impacts on trade. Joining or leaving an EO can seriously either help or hurt you. It can help or hurt your neighbors, so people who share a border with you, and it can help or hurt your allies. So, for example, us or Canada trying to join OPEC, because Canada does ship out quite a bit of oil and petroleum to us in the United States. 45% of the oil that is used in cars comes from Canadian crude oil. Fun facts. So if we piss off Canada, we're not going to do so well, and our gas prices are going to absolutely skyrocket. So there is that. It can restrict potential trade partners. So if you join into an agreement with OPEC, like say, for example, Canada joins into an agreement with OPEC, we don't really get along with quite a few nations that are inside of OPEC. In fact, we've slapped some things called sanctions on them before, and we'll get into that in part 2. Well, not part 2 of this video. It's going to be in our next lesson entirely. But if Canada decides to join OPEC, we're like, I don't know about that. That's not a good idea, Canada. People who used to fool with Canada might not fool with them anymore because they have chosen to join a specific organization. This is literally just like how countries decide to be petty against one another. If another country's decision severely hinders their country, they're going to be mad about it, and they're going to retaliate in some way, shape, or form. Typically not with the military. Usually they'll try some non-invasive and non-fatality causing ways first. This also can expand your partners potentially. It can expand the reach of your resources. Besides oil, Saudi Arabia really doesn't have a lot of natural resources to offer because it's vastly desert in Saudi Arabia. So they need to make sure that the one resource that they do have is significantly well priced so that it helps them. So they need to make sure that their reach of resources is a little further than they can go by themselves, and they do that easier if they're on a team. So they made the team, well, they didn't start it, but the team of OPEC got started, I want to say in the 70s or the 80s. And so they've increased the value, and they've increased the demand for their product as well. So there's power in numbers, for real, for real. All right, and then we're going to get into the negative consequences in part 2.